today, to talk about supply chain risk, we have Pat Grainey. Pat is the Director of Global Supply Chain Risk and Resiliency at Vertiv. He was previously the head of Global Supply Chain Resilience at Vestas, and has operational experience in the U.S. Marine Corps. So welcome, Pat.
Thanks, Sarah. It's good to be here.
Great. So I just have a few questions for you. First of all, we had previously talked a bit about your experience as a Marine doing disaster response. I'm just curious, what were some takeaways that you learned from the Fukushima meltdown that you could apply to supply chain disruptions?
Yeah, so I think one of the so maybe just by way of explanation, I was with the Marine unit that specialized in disaster response. So we did a lot of preparedness and drills for disasters. But then when the Fukushima event happened, I don't think anybody ever foresaw an earthquake followed by a tsunami, followed by a nuclear meltdown in the same place on top of each other. So it was really complex. But I think one of the things it taught us was that you can have essentially a whole country or a whole region inaccessible suddenly. And you don't necessarily have to be able to predict something as precise as, a nuclear disaster on top of natural disaster events. But there can be events that then essentially take large links of the supply chain just entirely out of the picture for an unknown amount of time. That was something that I think was pretty new to supply chains generally with that event, at least in recent history. And then we saw the next month the same thing happen in Thailand with the flooding in Thailand. It essentially disrupted production there for a month and crippled many parts of the auto industry in the States, just with how interconnected things were. So we saw that big events could happen. And then I think we saw that with sort of replay with COVID, where we look at China lockdowns for extended periods, where we're really planning for something on the scale of losing access to entire countries or entire nodes. It is important. It's important to be able to imagine that can happen and not have a failure of imagination. But then when it comes to planning around those sorts of things, it's not necessarily the specific plan that's important. We don't necessarily have to get right, sort of which country might lose access to for a few days or a few weeks. But, we used to say in the Marines, the plan isn't important, but planning is important. So being able to have relationships in place where you've worked through with people, what do we do if, who do we talk to if, it makes it a lot easier to respond to whatever actually does occur.
So you're talking about these sort of large scale disasters. How do you deal with those as opposed to sort of the smaller scale supply chain disruptions?
Yeah, a lot of it, to be able to really be resilient and sort of continue operations in the face of big disruptions really takes some advanced design and looking at whether it's production facilities and thinking about, do we have two production facilities that are capable of producing the same product? Even if they're not producing the same product today, how fast can one fail over and start producing another? Is it in another region? Do we have sort of big picture network design where we understand where we might be single threaded, where we might have vulnerabilities if something big does happen? Because then we can make big picture decisions around it. Once something like that happens, it's really too late to respond quickly.
Is it hard to sort of so you're talking about understanding, what your supply chain looks like? Is that hard to map out? I mean, I've heard some other executives talk about, the fact that it's hard to get past a certain tier.
It is hard to really map out. I mean, really, you can start with what you know. You can start with your own production facilities and your tier one suppliers. Even that is a big step forward for a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations don't really even have a plan at that level. So just getting started at that point is really important. But then doing the internal work and the internal discussions that are necessary to get a plan for internal production, backup options or suppliers, whether maybe it's dual sourcing or it's the same strategic supplier just producing for you in 3 different regions. just having that discussion can sort of lend itself to the next tier and doing the flow down and then talking to the commodity manager and say, okay, guys, same plan we just did for ourselves. You need you to talk to your suppliers. Do they have multi-region sourcing? What is their bill of materials health assessment look like? Do they need help? Do they need coaching? But let's just start the conversation and start working the way through the sub tier.
That makes a lot of sense. So you had mentioned the COVID crisis, and we all know that that was extremely disruptive for operations and logistics. How did your company overcome some bottlenecks? In our previous talk, you had mentioned that there were bottlenecks that your company faced in India. So how did you guys overcome that? And is it possible to build flexibility into your supply chain when you're sourcing from places like India that don't necessarily have strong infrastructure or like institutional flexibility?
Yeah, no, it's just another great question. So maybe just for introduction for everyone. So I was with Vestas when the pandemic started, and Vestas is the world's biggest wind turbine producer. So all the big utility scale turbines you see in the Midwest, a lot of those are produced by Vestas. And Vestas does a lot of production in the States, but 2020 happened to be the biggest installation year ever for wind energy in America. So all of the factories in North America were running at full capacity. All the factories globally were running at full capacity. So even before we had the pandemic start, it was already going to be a challenging year. Then, as Sara mentioned, we had a lot of production in India for the US, for America. But then when there were shipping disruptions and ports were closing and reopening, and wasn't clear which ports were going to be open when. There were ships globally just skipping ports or pulling in and not being able to load any cargo and sailing onwards, and it caused absolute havoc sort of globally. And Vestas in India produces a lot of blades, so blades the length of a football field, tower sections half the length of a football field, things that are not small and take multiple trucks to haul. We had ports that were close to, or we had factories that were close to the ports, but they weren't at the ports. So we would have a production facility, and there would be one road to the port, and the road would just be stacked up with trucks, bumper to bumper, from the factory to the port. And there were Siemens Gamesa turbines, there were Vestas turbines, there were other pieces of industrial machinery all lined up waiting to get on ships, and the ships would pull in, and the goods that were due to get on it couldn't get to the front. There was no second road, there was no infrastructure to clear the bottlenecks. So we were really stuck. And the way we ended up solving it was I was having a discussion with one of our sales executives who was coordinating what we called the war room. It was coordinating the leadership team in the States was meeting 3 times a week to talk about operational disruptions and what can we do as an organization to work through these. We were talking about how wind energy is critical infrastructure. Is there anything government-wise we can do? We were sort of admiring the problem. And then she mentioned that, oh, I'm friends with the public affairs lead in India. Maybe I should call him and see if he can do anything. So she called the public affairs lead in India, and he said, let me work on this. And then within a few days, we had gotten some of the local governments involved. We'd sort of found a route to cut through some of the red tape and get our cargo prioritized into the front of the line. So they found a way, and it ended up sort of opening the bottleneck for us. But it was lucky we had the conversation. We didn't sort of have that persistent planning relationship in place. We didn't really know what to do if. It was sort of good fortune that we had the right chat at the right time and we were able to unlock it. If we had the persistent sort of organizational planning in place, we probably could have saved 2 weeks with that. And that would have been a big difference for us.
That's really interesting. Save the day. So how do you, in your current role, how do you build resiliency into the supply chain? So is like that persistent planning part of it, or are there other aspects?
It is. So there's a couple different approaches. One is we look at some of the known big risks out there, geopolitical struggles, protectionism. And so we sort of were taking an approach of looking at, do we have multi-region production? Do we have a local option and a best cost country option? Do we have dual sourcing in place as sort of the minimum going in threshold for all of our critical components? And so that's from sort of the procurement commodity approach, sort of a horizontal across the board action we take. We're also looking at a product level approach where we say, let's look at the bill of materials for a Vertiv product that we sell. Let's do a health assessment on the bill of materials. And so we built ourselves a scorecard using data that we have internally to say, okay, dual sourcing is one aspect, but it's only one. In some cases, it may be a choice to be single source. We may be happy with that, but if that's the case, then we should be doing all these other fundamentals. We should have safety stock set in the system, and we should be sending a forecast in the system, and we should be looking at purchase order confirmation rates, and we should be looking at delivery performance and quality, and what are all the other indicators that let us be comfortable to sit single source with one component. Or we may say we have a single source risk that maybe we didn't really understand on a component that never would have been on the radar as high spend because it's a low spend component, but it's the golden screw scenario where it might stop production if we can't get it. So we look at the whole bill of materials, we score every part that we purchase, we include all of the fasteners, the plastics, the packaging, the labels. When we first did one of our scorecards and we showed it to some of the leadership, they said, why are we talking about labels? Let's get that off here. Let's get the noise out of here. And then one of the commodity directors said, hang on, we've had production stops in Mexico because we couldn't get the right labels. Let's make sure that we look at the full view. And so we look at every part and we do a considered analysis to say, look, is this a risk or is it not? The data says there's a risk here. If we can't get it, does it stop production? Do we have a stocking program in place? Do we have an agreed lead time with the supplier? What are we comfortable with? And then if we decide we can live without this label, we're agreeing we can live without this label. But it's a conscious decision. So what we really don't want is surprises or areas where surprises can come up where we haven't made an evaluation. So that's really a product level view that's not around a commodity strategy. It's around everything it takes to get this product out the door to our customer. Let's look at production risk and let's look at operational factory risk so that we can continue shipments, because it doesn't do any good to look just at the high spend or high strategic suppliers if the small stuff trips us up. So that's what we really want to avoid from sort of the product level. The other thing that really helps is the internal conversations, because one of the things we had to solve was procurement guys, we talk about commodities and categories, and no one else in the business understands that or cares. We're the cost center that's just telling them no, they can't do what they want because it costs too much. When we put it in product terms and shipments, that was really powerful. From it was powerful the operations guys, the sales guys, all the way up around the C-suite. Everybody understands it, and then we're talking the language of the business. And there's really no arguments as far as should we do this. We have some debates about how do we do it, or resources, or prioritization, what can we do, how fast. But it's a solutions-based discussion and not we're trying to get attention for a procurement initiative. This is a Vertiv initiative. And that's been really helpful as far as getting buy-in.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Would you be willing to share any aspects of your scorecard? What are you looking at, the regional location? Are you looking at, I don't know, other like lead time?
Yeah. So what we're really focused on, and what we decided to do was data. It's got to be real data from a system, whether it's our data or whether it's done in Bradstreet or S&P Global or some other data source we're paying from. It's got to be a system Otherwise, it's not scalable. If we have people going in and manually entering anything, it's not scalable. It brings judgment into it. We just want to say, okay, what does the data tell us? And then we do get pushback of, well, this data is not right, or doesn't tell a full story, or our master data is not good enough. But hey, guys, then let's fix the master data. The answer is not to ignore it; it's fix the master data. But we are as good as our data, so let's fix the underlying data if there's challenges there. But we have existing KPIs. We have things like supplier delivery performance. So you can look at promised delivery date or requested delivery date or on time in full, whatever your metric for delivery performance is, we just put targets against it or thresholds, and we say, okay, above 95% is a 1, under 90 to 95 is a 2, and then we tier it down to 80%. Anything under 80% is a 5, and then 1 is good, 5 is bad. We're golfing, we want lower risk scores, so we just give a 1 through 5 for that category. We do the same with quality. We look at defects part per million. There's different ways to measure quality, but if the company has a composite quality score, then we look at quality. We look at supplier financial health, and we look at the D&B score. And D&B gives a rating on insolvency likelihood. So if D&B says the supplier is at financial risk, we consider them at financial risk until they assure us otherwise. We look at relationship quality. Is this a preferred supplier? Is this a non-preferred supplier? And then we weight the different aspects to say, okay, quality is important. We want quality on there, but really delivery performance and relationship status, we weight higher. We give it a weighted score, and you can change the weightings based on what's important to your company. We look at dual sourcing. Is this single supplier? Is it dual supplier qualified? Is the spend under contract? Do we have a master purchase agreement in place, or do we have a lower tier purchase agreement, or are we just living PO to PO? We look at life cycle. For many of the parts, S&P Global will tell you expected remaining life cycle for semiconductors. Sometimes internal engineers will give remaining life cycle. So if a part is end of life or within 2 years of end of life, we know that drives an action. So we want things that will drive an action to make us better. And then we look at the ops guys don't like us in their area sometimes, but we look at what's the lead time we're achieving. Are we sending a forecast in the system? And then what's our purchase order confirmation rate? Because if we're not sending a forecast and suppliers not confirming our orders, we shouldn't be shocked when the parts don't show up. So just some fundamentals like that. Do we have system safety stock set? Are we using the system to do an award split between suppliers? We may do a 60-40 split between suppliers, but that shouldn't be a manual task for the buyers to have to manage that. That we have a system that can do that for us. Are we using it? So the scorecard is really looking at, do we have the fundamentals in place that will help reduce disruption? And what we look at is, can we get every part to a risk level of 20% or more? We want to drive out 80% of the risk. We're not saying there's going to be no disruption. We're not saying no risk or no surprises ever again. We're saying we want to quantify the risk and reduce it, because there's going to be disruption. There's going to be surprises, but even doing the things to reduce disruptions will help us bounce back faster or have options in place when whatever's tomorrow's unforeseen event that we can't imagine today is going to be. It puts us in a better position to respond to it. So that's really the focus there. But it's really around, what data do we have and what will drive an action to make us stronger. That's really sort of how we settled on the metrics we did.
That's really good. And that, I think, that provides some guidelines for other supply chain managers to follow.
Great.
So last question, a lot of supply chain executives have said, resilience is great, flexibility is great, but how do we build this into our supply chain at a cost that's not prohibitive? So how can you build flexibility in at sort of a lower cost?
So I think a lot of companies now are struggling with inventories. One of the things we struggle with, and I've seen it before, is just complexity, the amount of parts. Engineers love creating new parts. So that the tens of thousands of parts that are active in our system with thousands more activated every year really drives complexity because every one of those has to be quoted and set up and evaluated and managed. But one of the things that we're doing is driving part standardization. And we're working with the engineering leads to identify, look, these are the preferred parts. We're going to use these parts for future design. If you want to use a new part that's outside of these, then you have to go through a whole approval process and justify and show us why you can't use one of the preferred parts. And that lets us sort of really focus on optimizing those parts. And then when we do decide that we're going to split spend between two suppliers, we will sacrifice some volume discount versus going 100% to a sole supplier. But if we can do it on a smaller set of parts, we can actually bring in, we've seen where we can get a huge savings by consolidating the number of parts, then sacrificing some of that savings to do the supplier split is an easier sell because we are still getting savings overall by utilizing the consolidation of parts or going with preferred parts. One of the other things that we've really focused on is not necessarily dual sourcing at lower cost, but the revenue risk. And that's really powerful right now is looking at, okay, here's our products, here's the forecasted revenue, this product or this product family or this SKU that we're going to run through the scorecard, this is the revenue that we expect to bring in next year. So this is the revenue we're protecting. And if we want to set safety stock, or if we want to stock a program with a supplier that's going to cost us at 10% deposit up front, or we want $12,000 for the safety stock, it's much easier to do that when you're talking about hundreds of thousands or tens of millions in revenue that we're protecting, because it reframes the conversation and it gets the business on board. And there's an opportunity to use the engineers and the ops guys and everyone that's been telling, that everyone that's sort of woken up to procurement bottlenecks over the last 3 years, that wants to avoid disruptions on their side of the business. Look, this is what it takes, or look, there will be added cost, but we need you to support so that we can do the life cycle analysis, or so that we can do the make versus buy, or which factory do we source this into if we're talking to the operations guys in a cost-effective way. And it helps get the rest of the organization sort of supporting procurement, so we're not just on an island trying to figure out how to sacrifice a smaller amount of our cost savings, but how do we get the rest of the team helping us, we're all pulling in the same direction. And then we can focus on the ones that are the high cost drivers, or the ones where there's most opportunity to consolidate, and making sort of the right collective decisions about, okay, this one needs safety stock, this one needs a 50-50 award share, or this one needs the 90-10 award share, or we're comfortable leaving this single source because we know we have another factory producing that we can fail over to. So keeping the revenue focus and keeping the conversation around, guys, these are the products we want to protect and support. That gets the sales guys interested. It keeps the engineers interested. And then it's not just the procurement, you're costing us money again conversation. I think the other aspect is right now everyone understands supply chain resiliency. Maybe for the first time, since COVID lockdown started, people now understand it. So there's a good opportunity to sort of capitalize on that now and get people used to working that way and make it a way of doing business.
That's great. Yeah, there's some really good points that you've made throughout our talk. Thank you, Pat. So Pat Grainey, the Director of Global Supply Chain Risk and Resiliency at Vertiv. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sara. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.